Good afternoon and welcome to the Frank Islam Athenaeum event. We have a really excellent program lined up for you today. Following introductions, our distinguished speakers will offer their presentation in live interview format. We'll have a Q&A after that. But first, I'm delighted and honored to get things started by introducing Montgomery College's phenomenal Senior Vice President and Provost, Dr. Sanjay Rai. Dr. Rai.
Thank you, Fiona, and good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to welcome everyone to Frank Islam Athenaeum Symposia at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. I want to add a special thank to Germantown campus Vice President and Provost, Margaret Latimer, who is the host for today's event. And also to Dr. Fiona Glade, Dean of Communication Studies, English Language for Academic Purposes and Linguistics for coordinating today's event. In addition, I would like to recognize the great work of MC folks who have contributed to making this event happen. Mr. Stan Jones, our MCTV technical producer, and our Athenaeum Fellows from Germantown campus, Professor Amanda Miller and Professor Katima Lee. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the native peoples on whose ancestral homelands Montgomery College sits, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home here in Montgomery County today. This distinguished speaker series is made possible through a most generous gift from philanthropist and civic leader, Mr. Frank Islam. His powerful philosophy that drives this Athenaeum Symposium. If you conceive it, you believe it, you can achieve it. Mr. Islam's words are ingrained in our brains. Mr. Islam personifies American dream. He came to United States of America as a student, worked hard, lived by rules, and created a company, QSS, that he sold a few years ago for about $300 million. He used these resources for the betterment of less privileged, equity, social justice, and peace around the world. Students around the world, from Montgomery College to Aligarh Muslim University in India, have benefited from Mr. Islam's generosity and kindness. I am so thankful, Frank, for your support to MC. Thank you for choosing to live in Montgomery County. It is an honor and privilege to know you as a friend and a mentor. This year, our speakers have all explored the very timely theme of advocacy, activism, and public engagement. Every March, the Athenaeum celebrates Irish American Heritage Month in Maryland. Another important marker in our recognition of the immigrant community that has brought strength to our county, state, and nation. As we explore this theme in today's presentation, we honor the Irish roots of the Kennedy family, the discrimination faced by Irish Americans in the 19th and as well as into 20th century, and the far-reaching impact of JFK, probably one of the best known Irish Americans. This topic brings back some personal memories. Some of you know that I grew up in India and came to United States as an international student. In the 1960s, a surprise attack by China on the northern border of India, just after signing a peace treaty, left the still young and independent India worried that it would again be occupied by an invading nation. With a strong warning and intervention by President Kennedy, China's aggression was stopped. To this day, people of India admire and revere John F. Kennedy. People, including my parents, wept when they learned of President Kennedy's assassination. India mourned. My introduction to America has always been through values of innovation, generosity, and strength. In my humble opinion, these are some of the values that define American greatness and will continue to make America a great nation. Today, as news of war in Europe dominates headlines once again, our responsibility is to remind ourselves of the tragic human cost of organized greed and hate. Within our own country, we are seeing efforts to erase history and to silence the voices of victims of oppression. I thank Mr. Frank Islam for bringing us these opportunities for continued sharing and learning. And with that, and I pass the mic to Professor Amanda Miller, who will offer the introduction to our distinguished donor, Frank Islam. Amanda.
Thank you, Dr. Rai. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished donor, Mr. Frank Islam, whose powerful philosophy, if you conceive it, you believe it, you can achieve it, guides the Athenaeum Symposia. Mr. Islam is a successful entrepreneur, philanthropist, civic leader, thought leader, and he is a true friend of Montgomery College. It is through his generous support that we offer this distinguished speaker series, advancing meaningful conversations that extend beyond the events themselves, reaching into the classroom, the community, and beyond. Mr. Islam's own remarkable story of immigrant success is nothing short of inspiring. He came to the United States from India to study at the University of Colorado, where he earned bachelor's and master's degrees in computer science. He went on to lead a successful career in information technology, aerospace engineering services, and systems integration business for more than 25 years, where he garnered multiple industry awards for leadership, entrepreneurship, and excellence. Mr. Islam founded his information technology firm, the QSS Group, in 1994, and built it from 1 employee to more than 3,000 employees, and with revenues of approximately $300 million before its sale. Mr. Islam currently heads the FI Investment Group, a firm that he established after he sold the QSS Group in 2007. Mr. Islam has a special commitment to civic, educational, and artistic causes. In his own words, he strives to create opportunities that are sustainable and uplifting for humanity, guided by the virtues of hard work, focus, quality, innovation, and kindness. He serves on a number of boards and advisory councils, including the Kennedy Center Board of Trustees, the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the Brookings Institution. He also serves on various boards and councils at more than a half dozen universities, including Johns Hopkins University, American University, and George Mason University. We are most grateful for his friendship and generosity at Montgomery College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Frank Islam.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for your kind introduction. I should have you everywhere for my introduction. You did a fantastic job, and thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here virtually with Fred and Rachel and all of the Athenaeum participants. Today's event, though, is a special one for me personally because of its focus on John F. Kennedy. And this is true for 3 reasons. Number 1, President Kennedy inspired me when I was growing up in India, and I crossed the Atlantic Ocean to attain and achieve the American dream. Number 2, I have followed President Kennedy's call in his inaugural address to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country by sharing and giving back to the United States, the country that I love so much. Number 3, I serve on the advisory boards for the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government and the JFK Library Foundation. Those are the 3 reasons that this convening is special for me personally. What makes it extra special that I get to introduce Harvard Professor of International Affairs and History, Dr. Fredrik Logevall, and Rachel Flor, who's Executive Director of John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, who will have a discussion regarding the importance of preserving President Kennedy's legacy. Let me introduce them to both to you, beginning with Professor Logevall. I must admit that I didn't know much about Dr. Logevall, but as I did my research for this introduction, I discovered that his accomplishments are truly impressive and have concluded that he deserves much broader public recognition than he has received to date. Indeed, Dr. Logevall's bio is so extensive and so large that I could spend the rest of this session telling you about it. So I will just share some highlights. As I mentioned, Dr. Logevall is currently the Laurence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of History at the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Science. He has a distinguished teaching career specializing in U.S. foreign policy and Vietnam Wars. Among others, he has taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Cornell University, and the University of Nottingham in England. He has won numerous awards for his academic work, including the Warren F. Well Book Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. He was also selected as a top young historian by History News Network. Dr. Logevall is a prolific author. He won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2013 for his book, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. This book also earned him the prestigious Parkman Prize, which deemed it an extraordinary work of modern history. His other books include The Origins of Vietnam War and America's Cold War, The Politics of Insecurity. Today, we will hear directly about Professor Logevall's new book, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, a biography of which should take a deep dive into the superb archives of the JFK Memorial Library. JFK, Coming of Age, is the first volume of a two-part biography relating Kennedy's relationship, his formative experience during World War II, his writings, his ideas and ideals, and political aspiration from birth through his decision to run for the President of the United States at 39 years of age. In an interview for the Harvard Gazette on the book, Dr. Logevall said, and I quote, "I guess the conceit of the book is that I can tell two stories together. The story of John F. Kennedy's rise and the story of America's rise. I believe we can better understand the first half of the so-called American century through the lens of Kennedy's life." End of quotation. Those are just a few highlights regarding Dr. Logevall. Let me turn now my attention to Rachel Flor, who will be interviewing him. Well, while I didn't know much about the good professor, I do know quite a bit about Rachel because of working with her at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation. Rachel has been executive director of the JFK Library Foundation since October 2019. As the nonprofit partner and creative collaborator of JFK Library, the foundation promotes ongoing engagements with the issues at the heart of contemporary life that relate to the legacy of President John F. Kennedy. Rachel has served in a variety of roles at the JFK Library Foundation for more than 13 years. They include Deputy Director, Vice President of Communication and Digital Media, and leading the foundation's Profile and Courage Award and the New Frontier Award. During her tenure, Rachel has seen many of the foundation's well-known outreach initiatives, including the award-winning social media campaign at JFK Said. This project documented Kennedy's campaign and presidency in real time by posting quotations from President Kennedy's own words in contemporary Twitter conversation. Rachel has also led a number of nationwide celebrations, such as the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's administration, the centennial of John F. Kennedy's birth, and the celebrated 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. In Rachel's own word, and I quote, President Kennedy gave us a mirror in which we can see and strive to be our best selves. These are the values that I want my children to understand, and a reflection of the country I want them to inherit. End of quotation. In concluding my remark, let me say that we are privileged to have Fred and Rachel with us for this discussion. The invitation to this webinar, as Fiona said, their topic for discussion will range from the lens that President Kennedy's life offers on the US and global history of the time to key elements of President Kennedy's development as a leader and to ways in which President Kennedy fostered America's civic engagement. Let me put the emphasis on that final phrase, civic engagement. As someone who's a practitioner who speaks frequently on the importance of civic engagement, I look forward to listening to and learning from Fred and Rachel. I will listen in order to learn from the past so that I can apply those learnings to help create a better, brighter, and strong future for America and the world. I'm certain most of you will do the same. As you know, we are living in a very trying and challenging times, both domestically and internationally. I'm confident the conversation today will give us all some ideas on how to make a difference in them. So Rachel, the mic is yours. We all are ready to listen and learn.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. It's just such an honor to be here with you today and to be here with Montgomery College and of course with Fred Logevall. I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to spend an afternoon together talking about the life and legacy of President Kennedy. I just want to thank you, Frank, particularly for your service on the JFK Library Foundation's Board of Advisors and the support that you and your wife, Debbie, have given to our efforts to bring President Kennedy's life and learnings to new generations. And just thank all of you who are here today for watching and joining us for this discussion. So Fred, it's really great to have some time with you this afternoon. Thank you for spending your time with us. And I was thinking just about, what Frank said and what's going on in this world. And it seems really important given the current situation and the fact that we have an esteemed Cold War historian here with us today, to just start off and ask you, particularly in light of the devastating crisis in the Ukraine, what are you thinking about the situation and what can we learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis and President Kennedy's leadership? What are the insights? It seems like that's just a really clear example of how we can look to history to better understand our own times.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm just grateful to be with all of you at Montgomery College. I also want to extend my thanks in particular to Frank. And what an honor it is for Rachel and for me to be part of this symposium, to have an opportunity now for some discussion between the two of us. And then, as I understand it, also have a chance later for some more general discussion. I'm just privileged to be with you. Well, yes, Rachel. As you can imagine, I've thought a lot about the current crisis in a historical context over the last month. You and I had a chance to be together for a library event on this topic. And it makes sense to say at least a few words about it here. We can certainly continue that. Either the two of us can talk further, or maybe when we get to the Q&A, we can make further connections. It's just it's a terrible crisis that we're in. I think it's imperative that we have a ceasefire and a chance for ultimately, perhaps difficult though it may be to imagine that this could happen, Rachel, a settlement. And I think the connection for me with respect to the missile crisis, and I'll keep this brief so we can continue to other things, is that I think what President Kennedy showed, and I think all of you are familiar, the Cuban Missile Crisis is October 1962. It's the closest that the world has come to a nuclear war between great powers. And we can be grateful that we haven't come close to it since, certainly not to that extent. And I think that's in part because of what President Kennedy, I think, showed in that crisis, which was key, namely that he did not personalize the crisis. If you listen to the remarkable, and Rachel has done this, the remarkable missile crisis tapes, we actually can be a kind of fly on the wall. I do this with my students. I play excerpts from those tapes in my classes. They're amazing. But what you hear time and again is John F. Kennedy's refusal to personalize the crisis. He doesn't make it about himself. And his insistence on seeking a political solution. Even when most of his advisors are demanding or advocating an invasion of Cuba to get the Soviet missiles out, he refuses. I should also say, maybe the last point I'll make about this is that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader at the time, in other words, the counterpart to Vladimir Putin today, Khrushchev deserves credit. Khrushchev, when the chips were down, stepped back. He too agreed we've got to avoid any kind of nuclear escalation, nuclear, annihilation. And so the two leaders were rational. They showed a certain empathetic understanding, which is to say they were able to put themselves into the shoes of their counterpart. And it was critical in diffusing this crisis. There was also a secret deal that helped, as you know, Rachel, to bring this to an end. One of the questions in my mind, is there a secret deal that could be had in the current crisis? We can talk further about this. I have some thoughts on what such a deal could look like. But that's the connection I would draw to the missile crisis at this moment.
Well, it's really interesting. I've been studying myself the Cuban Missile Crisis for a very long time through the tapes, as you said, that we have in our archive, and just thinking about that in the context of the situation today, and really never having thought that we would get to this point today, in terms of where we were during President Kennedy's time in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's interesting to go back to that.
Yeah, there's just one thing that has occurred to me, and I think I may have said this in the event that you and I were together at the library for, but it's interesting that nuclear weapons may keep the Ukraine crisis contained in terms of the great powers, but it also helped to bring on the Ukraine crisis.
Right.
So it had this double effect that Putin surmised that because the West knows that I have an immense number of nuclear weapons in my arsenal, huge number, they're not going to respond with force to what I'm about to do in Ukraine. So the existence of the nukes helped bring this on. He then, of course, thought that this was going to be a cakewalk. He thought that the intervention was going to take about 72 hours. And boy, was he wrong about that. But I think I interrupted your train of thought.
No, I think all of that's important. And again, just it's that lens of history that gives us the insight for today, which is such an interesting way to think about current events, and what's always been exciting to me about the study of history. So let's go back. Your book, of course, JFK Coming of Age in the American Century, is 1917 to 1956. So we don't get up to, in this volume at least, to the presidency and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you have managed to uncover, I think, really interesting new ground on President Kennedy, his early life and sort of what the making of a president. So can you talk a little bit about, not many academic historians write biographies. So how did you come to this project? What made you shift gears away from Vietnam and Cold War foreign policy towards the American and American president, particularly JFK?
Well, part of it was a long-time fascination with this particular president. And as with Professor Rai, as with Mr. Islam, he was an inspirational figure to me. I grew up in Sweden, so I too am from a different country. And though I was born after his assassination, my parents talked to me about the kind of figure that he was, not just in death, but also in life, which I think is important. So it's partly that. I think it was also a desire to give biography a chance, in other words, to write a biography. I had long had that in the back of my mind, but to approach it from the perspective of a historian. And I was so grateful for Frank's excerpt that he read to all of us a few minutes ago, in which I really do believe that through the lens of John F. Kennedy's life, we can actually better understand not only him, that's obviously the core purpose of any biography, is to understand the subject, but I think we can actually understand American history and world history at a critical point in the middle decades of the 20th century in a way that we would not be able to do apart from that lens. And then we can get into specifics here, Rachel, in terms of things about the young Kennedy, because it's really quite a fascinating story, how this second of 9 children in this large Irish Catholic family that became one of the wealthiest families in America, how he finds his way, how he makes his decisions as a young man, the importance of the wartime service we could discuss, how he comes back from the war a different person than he went into that war, and then of course chooses a life in politics, and then the story is remarkable from then on as well. But that's the reason why I decided to pursue this. One last point about this: you're quite right, and this is maybe for the students and the professors in the audience. You're quite right, Rachel, that professional historians in particular shy away from biography. And I would frankly tell my own PhD students, you probably shouldn't write a biography for your dissertation. There is a bias against it in the academy, understandable on some level, regrettable on a different level. But suffice it to say, I probably would not have undertaken this project if I didn't have tenure when I started it.
Okay, so that's a good answer. That's good insight. And, before we get into, and I have a lot of questions about the details, because I'm excited to just be able to pick your brain a little bit about what you uncovered. But I want to ask you about the writing process and the research. Again, for, there's students in the room, and this is going to be multiple volumes. And it's about an American president who has, really captured the imagination of the country, if not the world. So there's just mountains of information, books that have been published, mythology. How did you navigate all of that to come to your own conclusions about his life and his path towards service?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm still probably working through that to a degree, even as I work now on the second of the 2 volumes. I think you're right to refer to the word mythology. There is so much mythology built up around John F. Kennedy that it can be hard. In fact, one of the reasons I'm doing the project to begin with is I think we need to try to strip away that mythology, to see him for who he really was, to understand him in the context of his own time, and get, I hope, a better understanding of this highly consequential, quite remarkable figure, a flawed figure, we should note, like any human being. He had shortcomings in his personal life, which we can discuss. He made mistakes as president, which we can discuss. but somebody I think we should take very seriously. And as the three of us, I think, and you yourself as well, so four of us, for whom he represents an inspirational kind of touch point for all of us. That matters. So I think the answer to your question is that I approach the process of writing this by saying I've got to look at the archival materials, including the incomparable materials in your own library. For those of you who are, thinking about pursuing some research maybe related to John F. Kennedy, let me tell you, the materials in the Kennedy Library, just down, I'm in Cambridge, so it's just 3 or 4 miles down the road in Dorchester, in South Boston. The materials are incredible. And so it's partly for me about trying to master those materials. It's of course about bringing in, as you say, there's so much literature. So I'm also looking at the secondary literature, some of which is really valuable, some of it less so. It's about using newspapers, which I think are an underutilized resource by historians. Another point for the students in the audience. Newspapers can be really helpful to your work. Oral histories. So bringing all of that in together, using my previous training as a historian, my previous work as a historian to try to understand better how to think about this. And then, of course, finally, it's about putting words on the page. I happen to be one of those authors who likes to think about a minimum word count. So when I'm working, I want to have, it depends on the day and how much time I have, but if I can get 200 or 300 words that I'm happy with, that's a good day. Certain days I want more. If I have a full block of time, maybe I can get 500 that I'm happy with. Mm-hmm. And then that begins to add up. It's a process for me, at least, of doing that. And then lots of outlining as I go. I could talk about process forever. This is just great fun, but that's a snapshot. And
so how did you decide you were ready to write? There's the research. Are you writing along the way, or was there a moment for you or a deadline?
It's such a great question. And I think I've shifted, Rachel, about this over time. I think when I started as an undergraduate and a graduate student, I thought, I got to do all the research, or at least most of it, then outline and then begin to write. I think now I do it a little differently, which is that I will do research. And then when I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what the narrative is going to look like and what the analysis is, what my early findings are, I actually begin to write. And then I'll do more research. And then I'll do more writing. So it's a little different than I used to do it. And that's maybe partly because of my busy life. I'm teaching and I have committee work. And I advise students and family stuff too. So it's partly maybe that life is busier, and it's also a major biography that's going to be, close to a couple thousand pages when all is said and done.
Right.
And it's probably also that I've just changed how I do things and feel like it's better now to do some writing and then research, then write, then research.
So speaking of that, and kind of starting to get into the meat of the book, you say several times in the book that you are making an attempt to recreate the life and times of JFK. That's what we talked about. So it's the American century through the arc of JFK's experience. And in your prologue, you write, any serious attempt to recreate Kennedy's world as he experienced it requires suspending as much as possible the knowledge of how it all turned out. Yeah. So how do you do this? How do you, I mean, what do you mean by this? I think it's a really interesting way to approach someone whose very existence has become so embedded in the American experience and in who we are as a country. So how do you suspend that?
Yeah, I don't think that you fully can, but it's certainly, I think, important to try. And this is something I say to my own students. You need to try to put yourself into the shoes of the person at the time. Try to see things from their perspective. Try to avoid as much as possible, as you pointed out just a second ago in the quote, considering how it all turned out. So with Kennedy, or with anybody, with any other figure, or let's say any president, try to avoid knowing, try to suspend your knowledge of the fact that he became president.
Right.
And of course, try to suspend knowledge of the fact that he was assassinated. So again, I don't think it's possible to fully do, but I think if we remind ourselves of that task, we can come closer. We can come closer to doing that. Among other things, it means avoiding seeing in this college term paper. So he went here to Harvard, of course, in class of 1940, and we have a lot of his papers at the library, some of them digitized. So if any of you are wanting to just check out something that JFK wrote in college, you can actually find it on the library's website. But what I try to do is avoid seeing in that college paper presidential greatness. We can see that this young man obviously was destined for big things. Not necessarily. In fact, he was in some ways a rather ordinary college student. When he applied himself, his professor said, this kid has great potential. But, it's not, I think, the case that you see that greatness in those papers. Senior thesis is interesting. That's kind of a special piece of work, as I point out in the book. And maybe you do see signs of greatness. But yeah, we need to try as much as we can to avoid seeing what happens later. Pretend that he never becomes president and write accordingly.
And it's interesting you bring up his, his academic life. And it's always been actually a source of inspiration, I think, could be for people that, he really did struggle. He wasn't the best student. And I've always loved the exhibit in our museum, Young Jack, that shows some of his early marks. I think he got a C- in public speaking. And, he was writing to his dad to let him know that he, his marks might not be that great this year. And his father writes back, basically, you may not be the best student, but I really believe that you can become a worthwhile citizen.
Yes.
And so, it wasn't, there were many steps along the way where he wasn't destined for the presidency.
No, and he was under his older brother's shadow, which
right.
is something
Talk about that, his family a little bit.
Yeah, well, so it's an important sibling rivalry. I think ultimately it was more important for Joe Jr., who was the older brother. So they're number 1 and 2 in the birth order for those of you who are new to this. So Joe Jr. is the golden child, movie star, handsome. He is the one that his parents believe is the one who will probably become president. And Jack comes in his shadow. I think ultimately the sibling rivalry becomes more important to Joe Jr. than it is to Jack, in part because Jack begins to outshine his brother. But he operates very much as a kind of second place person in the family pecking order, and I think that influences how he approaches his studies. The old adage, I can't lose if I don't compete, I think applies a little bit. So he actually steps off, doesn't work as hard as he might, in part because Joe is such a striver, and he doesn't really want to compete against him in that way. I think that matters a lot, but he comes into his own beginning, I think, junior year here at Harvard, just down the street, and then goes from there. And Joe Jr. notices this. This is something that he is very conscious of right up until the time he is killed in the war in 1944 in an operation that was a kind of suicide mission. And though I can't prove this, Rachel, I suggest that he volunteered for that mission in part because of Jack's heroics in the South Pacific the year before, which had gotten front page, headlines. Right. I think Joe wanted to match his brother's exploits, and volunteered for this mission. Just very quickly on the public speaking course. as you know, but maybe people in the audience don't know, a few years ago, archivists at Harvard uncovered a tape from that class, public speaking, 1937, in the fall, so the beginning of his sophomore year, that you can get access to. You can find it on the web. I think if you Google JFK 1937 public speaking, you can actually hear the young sophomore speaking. It's pretty incredible tape.
I actually don't know that I've heard it. So
Oh,
was it as bad? I thought you were going to tell us that it was as
No,
bad as,
no, I
would
think-
you have
I
given
think-
it a C-?
no, in fact, I think what I say in the book, I talk a little bit about that class in the book. I don't recall if I talk about the tape. But what you see is that he's already very interested in public policy, because
Mhm.
the topics that some of his classmates chose, for example, was how to find a wife. Somebody else said, how to bake bread. It's that kind of thing. He was interested even in his speech, that is the excerpted thing, in public policy and in about FDR's so-called packing of the Supreme Court, I think it was, or at least it was relating to the Supreme Court. So no, I have a more favorable assessment of the
Okay.
of his interest in the class. But we can just say here very quickly, he was not a particularly good public speaker when he started his career, even in Congress. One of the things that happens
Right.
as he gets closer to the presidency, and he works very hard at this. That's a lesson for all of us. Doesn't come automatically for any of us. He works really hard to improve as a public speaker. And as he gets into 1958, 59, and then of course 1960, he's much better than he was before. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that the grade in public speaking was not a particularly good grade.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, these formative years of his life, you briefly mentioned his experience in World War II, the pressure or the sort of ambition of his family, his sibling rivalry, and his interest in politics. Did you see early on an interest or an influence in terms of his commitment to service in the long run, and his civic life, that aspect, which of course became such a hallmark of his presidency?
Yeah, I think it is there. And I was grateful that Frank, in his introduction to us, referred to this aspect of it, because I think it's really important. And yeah, it's there early on. Here I give his parents, Joe Sr. and Rose, I just give them enormous credit for instilling this notion in their kids. You've got to believe in something greater than yourselves. We are immensely wealthy, so you could become, beachcombers. You could become slackers. But really the kids didn't become slackers. And so I think, hats off to them for really insisting on this from an early age. And, Rose, the mom, often is overshadowed for understandable reasons by Joe, her husband, because he's such a powerful personality. He is a dominant figure in the household, and as she herself would admit. And so she's sometimes in the historiography and in the biographies, she's very much in the background. But on this point, and others, JFK, I think, is in many respects closer to her in personality than he is to his dad. So we could talk about that too. But on this point, I think Rose deserves at least equal billing. Again, by suggesting to the kids from the time they were little that public service is hugely important. And it's actually what democracy ultimately depends upon. And I expect you, Jack, Eunice, Bobby, all of them, to fulfill this and to at least dedicate part of your life to this notion. It's there from an early point, no question.
So just, it's interesting because obviously that's the direction he took. And in your opinion, in terms of his early years of politics, which haven't really been given a whole lot of ink and research and discussion, was it the presidency? Was that where he was that where he's going? And what do you think are the important lessons from that period of time in his life, where we often forget, I think, that he served as congressman and he served as, in the Senate?
Yeah, I think he had his eye on the presidency from an early point. There's no doubt about this. I think he found the House. He served in the House. He was elected right here in the 11th District of Massachusetts in 1946, just back from the war. He's this skinny, 29-year-old running for the House, won that election. I think he found the House experience kind of frustrating. We're peons, he more or less told associates. And so began to set his sights on, I think then, the Senate. Some people suggested to him, why don't you run for the governorship? But because he had a particular interest in, he had a particular interest in foreign policy from an early point, which I write about, the Cold War, the Soviet-American confrontation. I think he said, well, the governorship is about handing out sewer contracts and about sort of, the nitty-gritty of state politics and to some extent local politics. That's not my thing. So it became the Senate, and he has this epic, absolutely epic victory against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in Massachusetts, one of the leading political families in the country, a very distinguished kind of moderate Republican, and Kennedy's kind of a moderate Democrat, so they're actually not that far apart on policy issues. But he beats Lodge. Unbelievable victory in some respects in 52. And then I don't want to suggest that he was deciding right then that he was running for president. Certainly by 56, which is where volume 1 ends, and I think it was therefore a natural endpoint, I think he's decided by the fall of 56. I'm going for it, and I'm going for it in 1960. Yes, some people will say I'm too young. Some people will say I'm too inexperienced because I'll only be 42, 43 when I take office if I win. Some people will say, for a Catholic in particular, this is just not a good combination of attributes, the youth, the inexperience, and the Catholicism. But I'm going for it. And then, of course, what I'm writing about now in volume 2 is this extraordinary effort to first get the nomination of the Democratic Party in 60. And then after that, he's got to beat Nixon in the general campaign. But it's a long way of answering your question. But yes, I think from an early point, he is looking to bigger things, first to the Senate, then to the presidency.
Okay. I'm interested to know, you write about his health and the role, throughout the book, the important role of his health in World War II, in the congressional campaign, and then of course in the 1952 run for Senate. And I know you reviewed a lot of medical evidence and analysis about his health problems. Can you tell us what you learned from the material? And did that change the way you thought of him and his life, his trajectory?
Yeah, it's a really important subject. I'd love to get your take on this too, because I think you're familiar with a lot of this. I think it was Bobby, his younger brother, who was really important in his rise to the presidency, and his closest advisor in many ways. Though they were quite far apart in age, 8.5 years. Therefore, they didn't know each other all that well actually growing up. But they became so close. And Bobby would say that my brother was sick every day of his life. And I think that's to an extent true. And he had last rites delivered at least 3 times. So he was at death's door,
Remarkable.
on numerous occasions. And beyond those 3 times, he got pretty close a few other times too. And I think it gave him, among other things, a kind of fatalistic view, I think, of life. I think it told him that you have to live each day as though it could be your last, which is not a bad philosophy to have. I think it taught him that life is capricious, that you just don't know what's going to happen. But I think it also had 2 other effects that I'll just mention here. Maybe one effect in particular. I think, Rachel, I'm not sure I can prove this, but I think it made him more determined. It was as though he wanted to prove to himself, prove to others, that this is not going to hold me back. And so in terms of running for political office, 46, as we said, for the House, he's in serious pain, in particular bad back pain. He already has Addison's disease, although it hasn't yet been diagnosed. He has malaria from World War II, from his experience in the South Pacific. This combination of maladies is just really debilitating. And yet he goes from dawn until, midnight, day after day after day, in that race for the nomination for the House seat in 1946. Unbelievable. He does this again in 51, 52 when he's running for that Senate seat. In fact, his aides are often completely exhausted, and JFK says, "No, we're going to keep going." So I think that in a funny way, this had it had that effect, or at least, let me put it this way: if it didn't make him more determined, because this is a family full of energetic people, as you know. It's a key, I think, to the Kennedys' success in so many areas, is that they just can go. And I think that's true of JFK, even with these setbacks. Related maybe to this, or maybe not, but I'll mention it, is of course that he suffered family tragedies of an extraordinary range. And I write about this in the book. I mean, think about this. The 3 oldest siblings, along with his 3 oldest siblings, he effectively lost.
Right.
Joe was killed in 1944. The sibling to whom he felt the closest connection, Kik, or Kathleen, killed in 48 in a plane crash. And he effectively also loses Rosemary, who's the closest to him in age. She's about, what, a year and a half younger, maybe 16 months younger, something like that, through a botched lobotomy in 1941, right before Pearl Harbor. So he's the only one of the 4 that, in a sense, remains. So, and that's bound to have an effect on him. So I mention it here because it's the combination of that and his health problems that gives him this fatalistic approach, but also, I think, makes him more determined with each day.
I agree. I think the more I've learned about the health problems that he had growing up, one of the documents that always struck me and has stayed with me as a mother, as I've had children, is his mother's health records. She was meticulous, as you know, recording all of her children's maladies and progress, growth, and everything. And just seeing how ill he was as a young child, and knowing that he went on to, volunteer and really, you can correct me, for World War II, he was going to go, and no matter what, even though he wasn't really eligible.
Yep.
It's that it makes the desire to serve more remarkable, that this was truly, he could have had many reasons to stay home all along the way and not raise his hand to serve. And that was just at every opportunity. he did, and it makes it more remarkable understanding what he was up against, I think.
I think that's so well put, Rachel. I agree with you completely. And, you know, his father was desperate to keep his sons out of the war. And, you know, Joe was a complicated person. And I think, evaluation of him in the first volume is mixed, shall we say. But I do give him credit for not standing in the way when Joe Jr. said, you know, I'm volunteering and I'm going to serve. And then Jack, following in his brother's footsteps. Jack, as you point out, or as you imply, Jack could have had a nice, secure desk job in the war. His father would have arranged that for him. In fact, he had a position in naval intelligence that, of course, mattered, but it was not going to put him in harm's way. And Jack insisted that he was going to see action. And his father actually helped make that happen. Much as he feared that he would lose his sons. And of course, he lost his firstborn. I think he never quite got over the fact that Joe Jr. was killed. But no, your point is really well taken.
So I want to make sure we have time. We have maybe 7 more minutes left. I want to make sure we get to talk a little bit about your plans for volume 2. We end this book where, as you mentioned, JFK, not President Kennedy yet, is ascending the ranks of American politics. It's 1956. He nearly had the vice presidential spot on the Democratic ticket, and he decides to run for president that Thanksgiving. Yeah. So how did you decide that this was the end of volume 1? You alluded to it a little bit, and that you're gonna, and what, and I guess I would want to, what I really want to know is what was most surprising to you about volume 1 before we turn to your plans for volume 2.
Yeah, let me take those in order. You know, I decided that the fall of 56 was a natural endpoint, and there is the conversation between Joe Sr. and Jack at Hyannisport at Thanksgiving that is perhaps apocryphal, although I have a couple of different sources that confirm more or less what happened. But they have a conversation after Thanksgiving dinner. The dishes have been cleared. The two men go into the study, which is, you know, off the dining room there. And they basically talk about the reasons why Jack should not run for president, and then why he should. Jack offers the reasons why he shouldn't do it. I'm too young, I'm inexperienced, I'm Catholic, they're never going to give it to me. And his father lists all the reasons why he should. You're as good as any of these people. You are better than most of them. You will have the support that you need, and you can win this thing. Now it's the time. And the conversation ends, and I thought, well, this is a good way to end my book. But their conversation ends with Jack saying to his father, well, Dad, I guess the only question is, when do we start? So it seemed to me that there was a kind of natural endpoint there. He has now become a major public figure. He is a leader of the Democratic Party, a leading young figure. By the way, his performance at the Democratic National Convention that summer, which was the first convention in which the networks gave gavel-to-gavel coverage. So millions of people are seeing John F. Kennedy for the first time. And he has a great performance. I mean, he leaves that convention as the party's great hope for the future. So it's a key point.
Right.
And I think it sets him on his way, and then therefore sets me on my way for volume 2. I think what maybe surprised me most in the first volume is that he was his own political master from an early point. I had thought he was under his father's thumb. As you know, Rachel, many people have made that argument that, you know, Joe Kennedy Sr. is a kind of puppeteer. and he's telling his kids, what to do and when to do it. And I think that was true to extent of Joe Jr. Joe Jr. was much less willing to challenge his father, to go against his father, than Jack turned out to be. So even as a college student, Jack is beginning to develop a view of World War II and of intervention in World War II that is very at odds with his father's position. His father is an isolationist. His father says, we have no business even aiding the British and the French, much less intervening ourselves, in so many words. And Jack becomes to see, partly through the influence of his professors, this is an untenable position, Dad. I'm not going to agree with this position. And so that's an early sign of what becomes a theme in the first volume, which is that at key points, when the two men differ, father and son differ, Jack charts his own course. Also in terms of political strategy, he doesn't really respect his father's political strategic, acumen. So he goes his own way, including even as a House candidate, I think. When the two of them differ on strategy, it's Jack who prevails. That, I think, is the thing that maybe surprised me the most, is that though his father is a very influential figure, he's a powerful personality, Jack loves him, he loves Jack, they have a very close bond. He's not going to let his dad decide his future for him or his political strategy or approach.
Fascinating. And I think, that is really new understanding, new perspective on a story that's been told, for years, I think, about how, and you get a sense of that when he's young, because he was the middle, or he was I don't know where the exact middle of 9 is, but he was not the one who was going along with necessarily living up to every family expectation. And
no, so I think as we've been discussing, it's hard, or maybe we haven't discussed this, I'll make this point. It's hard to exaggerate the degree to which Joe Jr., who was the oldest, and then Jack actually came second in that order, so he was second oldest. But it's hard to exaggerate the degree to which Joe had all the expectations upon him, wanted to live up to those expectations. I think it actually helped Jack.
Right.
Other children who may be tuning in today can perhaps relate to this, that if you're, it can be hard to be a middle child or a second child or a third, but it can also bring a certain security or an understanding that you don't have to aspire, you don't have to strive quite as much as the firstborn has to. And I think it worked for him. I've suggested in the book that he was the introspective son, introspective one among the older children. He was the one who liked poetry, didn't really want to admit that ever, but he did. He was the one who had an interest in words and their meaning. He was more of an intellectual in that sense than Joe Jr. was. He had an opportunity to cultivate some of those interests and to come at this a bit more slowly than Joe was able to do. I think it just mattered enormously in shaping who he became. No question.
Well, so we're almost out of time, but I would be remiss if we didn't get a little preview into volume 2. Okay. Again, This is a story we know. It's the campaign, it's the presidency. Yeah. But I'm so excited to be able to read what you discover, your take on that, and what do you hope people take from it? Or are you there yet?
No, I'm still working some of this out as I go, but the quote that Frank gave us in the introduction, in terms of better understanding not only the individual here, but the society in which he was a part and the country which he led, is what I hope volume 2 will do. And so I hope we better understand, among other things, the space race. and the moonshot, for example, the decision, the epic decision by Kennedy, with some reluctance, we might note, to embark on the lunar project. Civil rights. He was quite slow in his embrace of civil rights, partly for political reasons, substantially for political reasons. So I hope we can better understand the civil rights struggle in that period of 57 to 63, up to his assassination. Vietnam, a subject about which, as you know, Rachel, I've written a lot about in the past.
Right.
How did Kennedy approach the war in Indochina? Why did he make the decisions that he made? The prospect of nuclear annihilation. We began today by talking about Ukraine and the current issue. He had a deep conviction. Let's think about this with respect to Joe Biden today, because I think he shares it. But just in terms of today's crisis, Kennedy, I think, had a conviction from 1945, that is to say, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that nuclear war must be avoided at all costs. Therefore, great power conflict, military direct conflict between the two superpowers also must be avoided. And I think when we get to the missile crisis, that conviction helps, I think, drive his choice. Most of his advisors, as we were saying earlier, wanted an invasion of Cuba, or at least military action to get the missiles out, Soviet nuclear missiles. He said, no, that takes us up the escalatory ladder. The result can be the end of civilization. So I think, Rachel, and I don't know if this is a point on which to conclude before we turn to questions. You know, I'm not the first to say this, but I think the fact that we're all together today, and I see several faces on the screen, is in part because the cool heads prevailed in October 1962, and chief among them, I would say, was the President of the United States with a very important assist from his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev. But yeah, we're beneficiaries of that, and it's something that's useful to remember as we contemplate our current crisis.
Absolutely. I think that is a good place to end, knowing that preserving President Kennedy's legacy, understanding his leadership, and that his leadership is one of the reasons we're here today. Yeah. So thank you, Fred. This was so fun. I could do this all day, but I will turn things over to Fiona and audience questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Fred. This was a really profound and thoughtful look at JFK's life and the crucial impact of his far-reaching legacy. It was a very dynamic interview. I appreciated that. And I really also loved the close look at the writer's life. Especially, you know, as an academic too, there's a lot that really comes from those conversations with our students, right? That continued learning and continued new perspectives that I think the Athenaeum series really represents as well. I'm sure there are lots of questions from our audience, and we do have a little time. So I'm going to turn things over to Frank Islam Athenaeum faculty fellows, Professor Katima Lee and Professor Amanda Miller, who will moderate the Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A or into the chat.
So we have a question here from Scott Comer. Professor Logevall, could you please share your thoughts on the relationship between President Kennedy and UK Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, specifically their work to contain the Soviet Union's attempted expansion into both Cuba and West Africa? Are there lessons to be gleaned from their partnership in the context of Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine?
Oh, thank you for that, Scott. It's a really good question. The relationship is a very important one, and one of the things I'm going to do, in fact, in a few months, barring some kind of terrible, resurgence of COVID, is I'm going to go to London to do work in British archives. That's how important this bilateral relationship is. That's how important the relationship between Macmillan and Kennedy in particular is during the presidency. I might note here that Kennedy was from an early age an Anglophile, which is perhaps a bit ironic as an Irish Catholic, that he was so attached to sort of what we might call posh English men and women. That is to say, sort of the upper class in Britain. It's a fascinating subject unto itself. But I think it paid dividends in various ways through his early political career, and it continued into the White House. And so that so-called special relationship between the United States and Britain, I think adheres in the tense years of the Cold War in the early 1960s when John F. Kennedy is president. And so he relies a lot on Macmillan. He relies a lot on a close friend of his, David Ormsby Gore, who is the British ambassador in Washington. One of his closest friends, period, is Ormsby Gore. So that relationship is really interesting, and I want to deepen that. I already talked about it in the first volume, but I'm going to deepen it in the second volume. I think in terms of the specifics of your question that, I think that the reliance by these two leaders of the West, the two most important Western leaders, has lots of important benefits. It wasn't that they always agreed. In fact, there are Anglo-American tensions at various points during Kennedy's presidency. But at certain junctures, the fact that they were able to communicate, what do you think we should do? I don't know. What do you think we should do? Is, I think, profoundly important. And that includes during the missile crisis and again at various other points. And so what it tells me is that it's very important for Joe Biden to maintain open channels with his closest, in this case, I think, European allies. I think he has that from all that I've been able to see. I think that this, ironically, Vladimir Putin was hoping to weaken NATO, or believed that NATO was weak and was not united. And of course, this has served to galvanize Western powers. And so in so many ways, he's miscalculated in this crisis. And this is one way that he's done that. But that relationship, in this case, between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, the British are not as powerful, relatively speaking, as they were in 1962. But I think it still matters a lot. Thanks for that good question.
Thank you.
I thought the family dynamics that you discussed were so interesting, including the difference of opinion between JFK and his father.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned that John F. Kennedy had more in common with his mother in terms of personality. Father, I was curious if you could share more about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Amanda. I think that in a maybe the most important way here that he resembled his mom was in a love of, an appreciation of, and also a love of history. That she had a kind of historical sensibility that she tried to pass on to the kids. And as with all parent relationships, some kids take it, some don't. But Jack lapped this up, and so she would take the kids. She would pile a bunch of them into the car, and then usually they had a chauffeur, but the chauffeur would take them to various Boston historical sites. And as you know, Boston has a lot of them. And she would, along the way, pose trivia questions to them about when this battle happened, when that document was signed, who were the players involved, and she would quiz them on this. And Jack, from an early age, was really scoring really well on these maternal tests. But that continues. And I think that appreciation for history, that sense that history is unpredictable, or that international affairs are unpredictable, and we learn that from history, is something that stays with him. I think it's very important in terms of understanding his view of global politics. It comes substantially from his mom. A second way that I think she influenced him, also important, arguably maybe more important, I guess, is her love of politics. Much more, even though her husband, Joe, had his own political ambitions. He wanted to be the Democratic presidential nominee in either 1940 if FDR chose not to run, or 44 perhaps. Never came close, I think, to getting that nomination, but he was serious about it. But he never had an interest per se in politics, a love for politics. She did. Her father was a legendary figure in Boston politics, Honey Fitzgerald. She accompanied her father on the campaign trail when he was running for this or that office. She came to love it, not just the sort of, bands playing and the confetti and the sort of, ceremonial part of politics, but she also liked the backroom strategizing, political strategy, political tactics. She ate that stuff up. She gave that to Jack. One of the things that I conclude is that he believed in politics precisely because he knew that politics was important. And I think this is a message for our own day. And I think both parties in the United States need to convey that politics matters, that in a democracy, it has a really important role to play, that government has an important role to play. Doesn't mean that government can solve all problems, but it's very important in terms of, Kennedy believed, and I think he got it from his mom, it's important in terms of creating a more just society and allowing more Americans to reach the potential that they all have. It's a very powerful message. It's substantially from Rose. It's substantially from Rose. So she's huge. I think his temperament is also more like his mother's. And so it's a bit more reserved. He's not the sort of bull in a china shop that his older brother Joe is before his death. And so he's a little bit more like his mom in that regard too. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a question about Kennedy's legacy. What are some essential lessons undergraduate students should learn from Kennedy's life and legacy?
Mm. Well, some of this, Katima, we've touched upon. It's a really, I'm glad you posed the question because it's of central importance. I think about this a lot with respect to my own students. I think it's in part about understanding that anything in life that's worthwhile requires hard work. I think he understood that. He had privilege, as we've been discussing. They had great wealth. He had also, as an Irish Catholic, experienced discrimination, not as much as his parents or his grandparents. I write about this in the book, how the early generations of Irish Catholics suffered time and time again. But even JFK at Harvard, for example, there were certain final clubs, as the elite clubs here at Harvard are called, that would never admit a Catholic. Are you kidding? No way. So, but I think he determined early on that, there's no substitute for hard work. And that's I think a lesson for all of us, not just for undergraduates, but for all of us, I think, to remember. I think as I said a moment ago, the commitment to democracy, to politics, I think is something that we should all also take from the young JFK and also the latter day JFK. The belief, which he again got from his parents, in the importance of attaching yourself to something greater than yourself, if I can put it that way. So powerful. And our democracy, I think, in terms of whether it thrives or doesn't, will depend on people following that lead. It's extraordinary. We didn't talk about this today, and this is something I'm going to write about in the book. But the number of Americans of a certain age who heard his inaugural address, and I think Frank quoted the line before, ask not what your country can do, ask what you can do for your country. Which, by the way, was a line that he went to Choate, a prep school. His Choate headmaster used a version of that line to describe what Choate was about. So this was something that had been instilled in him early, that they used in the inaugural address. The number of people who were inspired by that inaugural address. What an address. 1,400 words is all it was. One of the great addresses, inaugural addresses in the nation's history, who were inspired by that to dedicate themselves to public service. It's an amazing number. I encounter people all the time who basically said, I had to drop what I was doing and come to Washington, or at least dedicate myself in some way to this. So that's, I think, a really important message. This belief that he had that democracy requires being informed. It requires citizens being informed. It requires a commitment to reasoned discourse, good faith bargaining between the parties. That's essential to a democracy, but in good faith. Lots there too, I think, Katima, in terms of what I would want my undergraduates or all of us, high school students, but all of us, wherever we are in life, to take away from this president.
Thank you.
So Professor Hollis has a question. She says, fascinating presentation. I'm curious if you found anything interesting in your research regarding the role of the civil rights movement in shaping Kennedy's Cold War policies.
Yeah. Oh, it's really good. Really good question. Yeah, I think he understood, even as a senator, that the United States was getting hammered in terms of its international position, was suffering in terms of its international position, including with respect to the Cold War, because of the way it treated Black citizens, African Americans, because of the segregation, not just in the South, but also elsewhere. Kennedy argued even in the Senate, and he continued to argue this in the White House. You know, we don't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of criticizing what goes on in communist countries, what goes on behind the Iron Curtain, if we're going to treat a substantial number of our own citizens as second-class citizens. And if we're going to have, you know, restaurants and hotels and buses and trains that are closed to African Americans, we're going to suffer from this. So that's partly in his mind, I think, about politics and about image, the effect on America's image. But he also believed it sincerely, and I do think, to go to the heart of your question, I think it influenced his policies. And what it did is, I think it ultimately also helped to move him intellectually and morally. This is not a particularly positive aspect of my interpretation of John F. Kennedy. In other words, I think he was too slow in coming around to the importance of civil rights in the United States. It's not that I think he was largely free of prejudice, I think, from an early point. I think he tended to treat people equally. I think in the White House, he also tended to treat the White House gardener with the same level of respect that he would treat a cabinet member. So it's not that I think he was particularly prejudiced, but for political reasons, he was overly cautious. He thought he needed Southern Democratic, he needed the Democrats in the South in particular to have any hope of winning the presidency. They were very powerful in Congress. They controlled many of the committees in Congress, segregationists from the South. He needed their support. He needed delegates from the South in order to win the presidential nomination in 1960. So he he moved very carefully with respect to civil rights, too much so. I think in 62 and 63, in the last year of his life, he genuinely came around, saw civil rights as a moral issue, saw that the presidency was critical in terms of, acting in defense of civil rights. It just took him quite a while to get there.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to Dr. Logevall and Ms. Flor for giving us these insights into your brilliant and relevant work. To our donors, Mr. Islam and his wife, Debbie Driesman, for your unfailing generosity and support. And to all of you, the participants today, for the gift of your time because you participated today. And thank you again, everyone, for supporting today's series. Good afternoon and stay safe.